Hello, and welcome to the Current Science and Technology Podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Current Science and Technology Podcast from the Museum of Science in Boston. I'm your host, Susan Heilman, and every week we bring you interviews with guest researchers and our museum staff covering science and technology in depth. Breathalyzers may not be just for sobriety tests anymore. In fact, in the future, they could be an important tool for doctors to detect diseases earlier. I have the museum's nanotechnology correspondent, Corrine Tate, here to talk more about this new technology. Hi, Corrine.
Hi, Susan.
So we're talking basically about a breathalyzer that detects disease, which would imply that certain diseases you exhale something that could be detected. We're not just exhaling CO2.
We're not. And actually, the way alcohol breathalyzers work is essentially some of the products in our blood end up in our exhaled breath. And with diseases, there are a wide variety of diseases that are related to different cellular processes, and they produce byproducts. These byproducts end up dissolved in our blood, and eventually they'll be exhaled in our breath.
So what types of things are they detecting in what types of diseases? Do they have specific ones in mind?
They do. Recent research has revealed that certain biomarkers are associated with certain diseases. For example, patients with diabetes have certain levels of acetone in their blood. Nitric oxide is associated with certain pulmonary disorders and childhood asthma. And even ammonia could be used to monitor kidney function in patients that have kidney failure.
And just like with the regular breathalyzer, all of these things would eventually come out in our breath, and this machine would be able to detect these small amounts coming out?
Yes, and what you mentioned is actually really important. There's not a ton of this stuff in our exhaled breath. Our exhaled breath is a sea of a huge variety of different molecules, and these tests need to be very specific. They're looking for minute amounts, tiny amounts of very specific molecules or these biomarkers.
Because in everyone's breath, there's going to be some CO2 or some oxygen and some water vapor and all these other things. So they have to be able to specifically isolate the ammonia or the ethane.
Exactly. So being able to detect these specific molecules is the key to these breathalyzers. It essentially needs to be a very specific chemical sensor.
So how exactly does the sensor work?
These sensors are using nanotechnology in different ways. There's a few different sensors I'm going to talk about today. The first device I'm going to mention was designed by Dr. Prerna Guma at Stony Brook University. And she wanted to design a device that would take a single exhaled breath and be able to detect several different diseases. She was specifically looking at the biomarkers I mentioned before, ones for diabetes, ones for asthma and other pulmonary disorders, and for kidney function. And the way her device works is that there's a sensor chip that has these tiny nanowires.
So when you say nanowires, you're talking about basically it looks like regular wires, but on a really, really tiny scale. Are they in some sort of a pattern or a lattice work?
There's no specific pattern, but the way they're manufactured is special. They're made through an electrospinning process. That basically means you're shooting a liquid out of a syringe into an electric field, and that electric field basically makes this liquid crystallize into kind of this big old mess of these nanowires. You can imagine kind of a microscopic pile of spaghetti is kind of what it might look like. And this electrospinning process is really a great manufacturing tool for this because we can make large amounts of it very quickly and very inexpensively. So the idea is that we could mass produce these sensor chips to make a device that people could use in their homes.
Now, once you have this mass of nanowires, how are those nanowires able to detect the ammonia or acetone?
Well, depending on what these nanowires are made of and what molecules they're coated with, they're basically specially designed to capture one specific molecule. So each sensor chip actually has several different types of nanowires to pick up whichever particular biomarker they're looking for. So once these nanowires capture the specific biomarker they're looking for, we can actually also tell how much of that biomarker is present. So not just that it's present, but also at what levels, which helps us come up with a more specific diagnosis.
So you mentioned that this is hopefully going to be relatively inexpensive for people to use in their homes. So when do we expect to see this? How far along is it? And how inexpensive could it possibly be for people at home to have their own, basically, disease detection equipment?
Those are great questions, and this technology is actually pretty well developed. They're in the middle of clinical trials, making sure that it's safe and effective and it works well. And the idea is that within a couple of years, you can have an at-home diagnostic tool. And what Dr. Guma is kind of shooting for is to have at-home diagnostic device that would be about $20 that you could use for about a year. So something that is very conceivable that a lot of patients could be using on a regular basis.
And how large would this type of thing be? You picture medical equipment being, big, bulky refrigerator-sized things.
Basically the size of a shoebox. There's a valve that you have to blow into and kind of a reader that monitors the biomarkers you're detecting. But it's a small device that people could comfortably use at home.
So let's get into what the second device detects and how this one works.
Sure. This other breathalyzer test I wanted to talk about is put together by Metabolomics, which is a startup company in California, and they had designed a breath test for lung cancer. Now, this has already gone through clinical trials, and they recently reported results that this breathalyzer was able to detect lung cancer with 83% accuracy, and it was even able to differentiate between different types of lung cancer.
Wow, that seems incredibly impressive. How exactly is this particular device working with? Is it still a nanowires looking for biomarkers?
It is looking for biomarkers, basically these cancer cells that are forming tumors. Just like, all cells, they have metabolic processes and they have byproducts that end up in our blood and specific biomarkers. This device works a little different than the last one I talked about because what it's looking for is kind of a biosignature, almost a fingerprint of different biomarkers that would be associated with these types of cancers.
So it's not looking for just ammonia or just something, but a bunch of them in certain amounts.
Exactly. It's looking for a very specific mixture that we see associated with lung cancer. So the technology behind this one isn't nanowires. It's a nanoporous gel that has pigments in it. And these pigments change color when they are exposed to certain chemicals. And it's the changes in color, these color patterns that result, that is compared to a computerized library of biosignatures associated with different types of lung cancer. So it works in a different way. It's still detecting minute amounts of specific chemicals, but we're just comparing it to a biosignature that we would expect to see with different types of lung cancer.
Well, this definitely sounds an easier, less scary way of being able to detect lung cancer by just breathing into a machine and not having to go through, I guess, scarier, more invasive tests.
Exactly. Lung cancer is something that's very scary for patients to have. And the current tests actually lead to a lot of false positives, which then end up leading to invasive procedures like biopsies or repeated CT scans to monitor the development of something that could possibly be a tumor. So this breathalyzer is kind of the best possible, least invasive screening tool that would really change the way that we monitor and diagnose lung cancer.
And it's not just lung cancer that has a specific biomarker signature. Can this be used for other cancers? They just have to figure out what that signature would look like.
Exactly. This device is being tested with cancers of the breast and of the colon as well. A lot of people might think that because it's lung cancer, that's why it's easy to detect in a breath test.
Right.
But it's not actually, because it's in the lungs. These byproducts end up in the blood, so we can detect disorders that are elsewhere in the body as long as it has byproducts in the blood that will eventually end up in exhaled breath. So they are in clinical trials with some of these other disorders, and they're actually continuing to advance their technology and come up with much more sensitive tests that they think they're going to put their accuracy levels up above 90%.
I really had no idea that there were so many different things in my exhaled breath, let alone that we would be able to develop detectors that could detect all the different things that was coming out in my breath. I think it's a really useful innovation that people are able to take that, something so non-invasive, and be able to use it to diagnose disease and some really horrible diseases as well. And that would definitely help earlier diagnosis, earlier treatment, better prognoses, all of that just from a breathalyzer.
It is really amazing technology.
Well, thanks for sharing it with us, Corinne.
Thank you, Susan.
That's it for this week's show, but be sure to come back next time for more of the latest in science and technology. This podcast is a production of Current Science and Technology at the Museum of Science in Boston, part of the Boston community for over 175 years. For more information, visit our website at www.mos.org/CST or email us at podcast@mos.org. Thanks for listening.